I thought I had successfully discarded my wife like a worn-out suit, but as I stood in the center of the gala, I realized she was the one holding the warrant that would ensure I never saw the sunlight of freedom again. My perfect new life was a trap, and the woman I betrayed had just arrived to watch my empire turn to ash. "Left the eyesore at home," I whispered into Elena's ear, my hand resting firmly on the small of her back as we glided across the polished marble floor of the ballroom. She giggled, the sound like tinkling crystal, and leaned closer, her perfume, something expensive and floral, masking the scent of the frantic anxiety that had been clawing at my throat all evening. By eyesore, I meant my wife, Sarah. The woman who had spent the last decade building my empire from the ground up, only to be discarded like a worn-out suit the moment she dared to have an opinion that didn't align with my own. The gala was the social event of the year, a shimmering display of wealth where every smile was bought and every handshake was a transaction. I was the center of it, the rising star of the city's development scene, and Elena was my perfect, silent accessory. She was 6 months pregnant, glowing in a dress that clung to her changing silhouette, oblivious to the fact that I viewed her current state as both a trophy and a liability. I had told Sarah I was attending a private, high-stakes negotiation with investors. She'd looked at me with those tired, knowing eyes, the kind that see through lies like glass, and simply turned away to tend to the garden. I hadn't felt a shred of guilt. "You're tense," Elena murmured, her fingers tracing a soft circle on my tuxedo lapel. "Just business, darling," I lied, signaling a waiter for another scotch. My drink was strong, but it didn't dull the hum of paranoia that had been buzzing in my skull since I'd received that anonymous envelope 2 days ago. Inside were photos. Not of me and Elena. That would have been amateur hour. These were photos of my secret accounts, the ones connected to the organized scheme I'd been running behind my partners' backs for years. Someone knew about the illegal weapon shipments, the laundering of the packages with substance that moved through our construction sites, and the web of bribes that kept the authorities looking the other way. I felt untouchable, yet here I was, sweating through my silk shirt. I scanned the room, searching for a familiar face, a sign that the threat was contained. I'd spent thousands on private investigators to track the sender, but every lead ended in a digital ghost. I needed to act fast. If I could just close this deal tonight, I'd have the liquid capital to vanish, to take Elena and leave the wreckage of my past and my wife behind. I turned back to Elena, intending to steer her toward the balcony for some privacy, when I froze. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Near the velvet-roped entrance, a figure stood in the shadows, watching me with the intensity of a predator, waiting for the right moment to strike. It wasn't one of my associates. It wasn't a rival bidder. It was someone I hadn't seen in months. Someone who should have been hundreds of miles away, isolated and under the watchful eye of the Internal Security Service. It was Sarah. She wasn't in her usual drab gardening attire. She looked devastatingly elegant in a midnight blue gown, her posture regal, her gaze cold enough to shatter diamonds. Standing right beside her was a man I recognized instantly. The lead investigator from the Internal Security Office, the one man in the city who could bury me under an accusation of a major offense, a charge that would ensure I never saw the sunlight of freedom again. I felt the blood drain from my face. My glass slipped from my fingers, shattering against the floor with a sound that seemed to silence the entire orchestra. Sarah's eyes locked onto mine. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She simply tilted her head, raised her champagne flute in a slow, mocking toast, and began to walk toward us. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, and in that agonizing second, I realized with terrifying clarity I hadn't left the eyesore at home. I had brought the witness to my own funeral. The champagne flutes in the room seemed to shatter in slow motion, the ringing in my ears drowning out the jazz band's upbeat tempo. I felt Elena's hand slip from my arm, her touch suddenly cold. She had noticed the shift in my demeanor, the way my skin had turned the color of parchment. "Julian, who is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I couldn't answer. I couldn't even breathe. My eyes were glued to Sarah, who was moving through the crowd with the grace of a woman who had already won a war I hadn't realized we were fighting. Beside her, the investigator was scanning the room with calculated precision. He didn't look like a man at a party. He looked like a wolf in a shepherd's coat. Every guest he passed seemed to shrink away, sensing the lethal energy radiating from him. I wanted to bolt, to shove Elena into a cab and drive until the fuel ran out, but my legs felt rooted to the expensive floorboards. If I ran, I was admitting guilt. If I stayed, I was walking straight into the trap they had spent months meticulously constructing. "Don't make a scene," I hissed at Elena, my voice a jagged edge. I grabbed her arm a little too tightly and she let out a sharp gasp. "Just stay here. Don't speak to anyone." I didn't wait for her response. I turned, attempting to navigate through a throng of socialites toward the side exit, but the room felt like it was shrinking, the walls closing in. Every face I passed, the politicians, the developers, the sycophants, suddenly looked like a jury, their eyes wide with a judgment I hadn't noticed before. Was it paranoia, or had the word finally gotten out? Had the Internal Security Service already leaked the files on my organized scheme to the local press? I ducked behind a massive marble pillar, pulling out my phone to dial my fixer, the only man who knew where the physical evidence of my illicit business was buried. It rang once, twice, and then went to a busy signal. My stomach did a somersault. I tried again. Same result. My lifeline was severed. "Looking for someone, Julian?" The voice was cool, precise, and completely devoid of the warmth I had once mistaken for devotion. I whirled around. Sarah was standing inches away, having circled the room to cut me off. She held a small black smartphone in her hand, the screen glowing with a series of documents I recognized all too well. The digitized ledger of my offshore accounts and the encrypted transcripts of my calls with the radicals I'd been supplying with illegal hardware. "Sarah," I started, my voice cracking. "Listen, you have to understand. This is a misunderstanding. These documents, they're forgeries. Someone is trying to set me up." She laughed, a short, sharp sound that held zero mirth. "A misunderstanding. Julian, I've been sitting on these files for 3 months. I watched you whisper lies to your mistress while you planned your departure. I watched you dump the illegal materials at the construction site, convinced that no one was watching. You thought I was just the eyesore at home, didn't you? The woman who couldn't handle the complexities of your business." She stepped closer, her perfume, the scent of roses and wet earth, overwhelming my senses. She reached into her clutch and pulled out a small metallic device. My heart plummeted. It was a digital recorder, blinking with a steady, menacing green light. "The investigator isn't here for a gala, Julian," she whispered, her eyes burning into mine with a terrifying cold light. "He's here for the confession you're about to give, and if you think you can talk your way out of this, look behind you." I slowly turned, my limbs feeling like lead. Standing at the entrance of the ballroom were 3 men in tactical gear, their faces hidden by heavy shades. They weren't security guards. They were enforcement agents from the Internal Security Office, and they were holding something that made my blood freeze solid, an arrest warrant with my name in bold black ink. "They have the illegal shipments," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper that sounded like a death knell. "They have the locations of the warehouse, and they have a witness who is ready to testify about everything, including the attempt to frame my father for your crimes. Do you want to know who the witness is?" I felt a cold sweat break across my forehead as she leaned into my ear, her breath warm against my skin. "It's Elena." My world shattered. I turned back to the dance floor, desperate to find her, to pull her away from the lies, but she was gone. Standing in the center of the floor where she had been moments ago was the investigator holding her by the arm. She wasn't struggling. She was looking at me, and for the first time I saw the truth behind her eyes. There was no fear, no pregnancy, no love, only the calculated, hollow stare of an undercover agent who had been watching me from the very first day. The lights in the ballroom flickered, and as they died out, I heard the sound of heavy boots moving toward me. The exit was blocked. The truth was out. And the shadow of an enormous prison sentence stretched long and dark across the floor. The ballroom lights flickered back to life, but they didn't illuminate a party anymore. They illuminated a cage. The music had ceased, replaced by the rhythmic, heavy thud of combat boots hitting the marble floor as the enforcement agents moved in like a closing vice. My surroundings, once a display of my status and power, had become the stage for my public execution. I looked at the investigator, then at Elena, or whatever her name actually was, and then back to Sarah. The eyesore I had dismissed for years was the architect of my total collapse. She didn't look triumphant. She looked bored, as if she were watching the final, predictable act of a poorly written play. "You think you're so clever?" Sarah said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence of the room. "You thought you could trade me in for a younger model, for a fresh start, while you spent your evenings trafficking in misery and danger. You thought I was just the shadow in your home, the woman who would wait patiently for you to return from your business trips. But while you were building your little illegal network, I was busy building a case." The lead agent grabbed my arm, his grip like a steel shackle. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply clicked a pair of handcuffs around my wrists, the cold metal biting into my skin, a permanent reminder of the life I was about to lose. I glanced at Elena one last time. She wasn't pregnant. Her hand brushed against her midsection, pulling away a subtle foam prosthetic that had served its purpose perfectly. She didn't offer a look of betrayal. She offered nothing at all. She was a professional, and I was just the job. "The Internal Security Service has been tracking your every move for months," the investigator finally spoke, his voice booming in the quiet room. "The weapon shipments, the laundering operations, the bribes. We have every document, every digital trail, and every testimony needed to put you away for decades. You didn't just break the law, Julian. You became a parasite. And the state doesn't take kindly to people who threaten its stability." I looked around the room, hoping for a sympathizer, a friend, a business partner who might pull a string or call a judge, but the ballroom was empty of allies. My friends were already turning their backs, distancing themselves from the sinking ship that was my life. I was a leper in an Armani suit. "Why?" I choked out, looking at Sarah. "After everything? Why destroy me this way?" She stepped forward, reaching out to straighten my tie one last time. It was a gesture of sickening intimacy. "Because, Julian, you didn't just betray our marriage. You tried to frame my father for your crimes. You thought you could sacrifice my family to save your own skin. That was your one mistake. You underestimated the daughter of the man you tried to destroy." She stepped back, and the agent shoved me toward the service exit. As they led me through the kitchen, past the stunned staff who had once served me champagne, the reality of my future began to sink in. There would be no high-stakes negotiations tomorrow. There would be no private islands, no new life, no escape. There would only be gray walls, iron bars, and the realization that I had spent my life building a castle on a foundation of sand. Outside, the cool night air hit my face, but it didn't feel refreshing. It felt like the last breath of my freedom. As they pushed me into the back of an unmarked van, I saw Sarah standing at the entrance of the gala, looking out at the city skyline. She looked stronger than I had ever seen her. She was no longer the woman in the shadows. She was the one who had stepped into the light to extinguish mine. As the van doors slammed shut, plunging me into darkness, I realized that the eyesore I had tried to leave behind had been the only real thing in my life, and I had traded it for a fantasy that had finally, brutally woken up. The engine roared to life, and as we pulled away, I stared at the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the wet pavement. My life was over. The trial, the enormous sentence, the total erasure of my name, it was all just waiting for me down the road. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see a way out. I simply saw the end.